Smart filters is one of the greatest benefits of the way smart objects work in Photoshop, and that's because it changes the rules, again, of the way we work with things. As we saw in the opening lesson, smart objects gives us lots of flexibilities. In the case of smart filters, an amazing set of capabilities. So for example, I've got my photo layer here, and in the past, if I wanted to do something like apply a blur to her face to soften it, what I would have done in the past is to duplicate the layer, apply the filter, apply a layer mask, which is all very nice, but then I've got two layers for everything. So instead, by converting this to a smart object, in this case I'll use the convert for smart filters, even though it really doesn't matter as long as that symbol applies. Now I could do, for example, a Gaussian blur. Well, a few things you'll notice right away, besides the fact that I have way too high of a blur. It's actually kind of a cool effect, but not what I was imagining at all. So one of the challenges with filters, especially in this case when I'm going to lower the opacity and do some masking, is to guess how much should I blur in order to get the effect that I want. So I'm going to blur way too much initially, just to show you a couple of the benefits of the way smart filters work. When I click OK, in the past when I clicked OK, it was a done deal. Now when I click OK, the layers panel changes to show me now there is this thing right here that says Gaussian blur, and this is the smart filter. And we're seeing several parts of it. The word Gaussian blur means this is the actual filter itself, which I can, for example, turn on and off. And I can also double click on it to edit the settings. And this is huge because now it means a filter is not permanent anymore. You can always go back and change it. The other two things we'll see here are a layer mask associated with the smart filter. So for example, let's just show real quickly here. If I took my paintbrush with black as my foreground color, set everything back to normal, any part that I didn't want the blur to be applied, now I can selectively apply the filter, which still looks really odd because her face is blurry. So here's the third part of smart filters, is this little filter blending options icon right here to the right of the name of the filter. We double click on that and it opens up a little dialog box that has layer-like options, blend modes and opacity, but specifically applied to the filter. So for example, in this case I could start to lower the opacity of the filter so I get a much softer kind of effect. And not that I would probably in this case, but I could also say what happens if I change the blend mode to overlay or multiply or something else. And you can see kind of the result. I'm going to put it back to normal in this case. But the real key to this whole thing is nothing I've done here is permanent, because I can change the filter either by hiding it completely or double clicking to change the effect. Now this is with that lower opacity already in effect. So as I start to now play with this filter, I can get very different results. Let's put it down much lower, and we're just getting kind of a skin softening effect. Remember, I have the layer mask, so there are parts of when I'm doing this softening, I don't want her eyes to be soft, so I'll paint over that with black. I don't want her lips to be soft, and I want to make sure that the hair detail is there. If I make an even smaller brush, get her eyebrows in detail. And this works like a regular layer mask. Look at this. It just looks like very strange, like grade 5 portrait. But anyway, it's the same principle as any kind of mask in Photoshop. Black will hide the effects of the filter. White will show. So in this case, I want basically there to be white everywhere where her skin is and black everywhere else, which is really what I've got going on here. So at this point, even when I save this, now I can come back later on and change anything. All the factors we mentioned. The mask itself I can turn on or off by holding down the Shift key and clicking, and that will hide the mask for the smart filter. Or as we saw, I can turn the whole filter on and off, double click on it, change the settings, or double click on the blending options to decide if I want to change the opacity and the blend mode and all those things. Now the other thing about smart filters, which is both good and kind of unfortunate, is that we can actually add multiple smart filters to one smart object. So if I wanted, for reasons known only to me, to also add a motion blur, which again probably wouldn't make any sense at all in this case, but let's do it just so you can see. Now you see we have two filters in the list. I can play around and decide between them. I can have them both showing, but here's the unfortunate part of it. There's only one mask. So even if you have a list of 4 filters, you're going to only have one mask associated with that one smart object. But it still means you can experiment and compare between and say, what if I did only a motion blur, not a Gaussian blur? That's just kind of weird, so maybe let's change the angle and put the distance. Again, this is not a practical example because you really wouldn't do a motion blur to someone's face. Well, maybe you would, but really it's just to show you that you can have multiple smart filters applied to one object. And again, the same rules apply, and this is really big, apply to type, where I can go and say, let's convert that to a smart object, and now I could do things like, well, let's do a motion blur here. It might make a little more sense to have a cool effect. So I start off by really blurring the text, which is just kind of weird, so I double click on this and change the blend mode to something else, and you can see right away I've got a pretty interesting effect happening, but once again, still editable text. So if we decide we need to change the text, now in this case I'd have to make a small adjustment because I went from having uppercase text to lowercase text, so let's go back and fix that. Just take my crop tool and just give myself a bit more room so I can see it, and then update it. Now it will allow me to see the rest of it. Now, one more example in this. Let's actually undo a few steps so we go back to the point where I'm going to get rid of this big copy. So now I have one type layer. If I convert it to a smart object and then duplicate it, so now I have a copy of that. I'm going to take the top one and make it much bigger like I had it before and drag it down below the photo. Same as ideas I had before. Lower the opacity way down so we're getting kind of the same effect we had initially. Let's put it somewhere where we can see it. I'm going to put the opacity a little higher so you can actually see the effect. And then we'll take this type layer and bring it down just so we can see. Now, whenever you duplicate a smart object, we'll be getting more into this as we go through the rest of the lessons, this is the same smart object, just duplicated. So there's 2 copies of the same thing. So if I double click on either one of them and make a change, for example, pick a different typeface. Let's just get this so I can see it all. There we go. Again, save it, and you'll see that both the type layers update because they're just 2 copies of the same smart object. And again, if I applied a smart filter, I can either apply it to one or both. So let's say I wanted both of these to have some noise added for some reason. Again, I'll do way too much just so you can see that something is happening. But you'll notice in this case, even though I've applied the smart filter to the top one, it did not automatically, because in that sense they're separate. They're the same object when it comes time to editing, but if I want this same smart filter on this one, I just have to copy it. Hold down Option or Alt, take that smart filter and drag it onto here, and now it has the same smart filter as well. I still have to edit them separately, but it's easy to copy from one to the other. So that gives you a couple of ideas of what's possible with smart filters. We're going to take advantage of smart filters in many of the examples we'll give throughout the rest of the lessons.